Go. All right, and we'll get started here. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for today's book talk with Elena Pedigo Clark. And we're celebrating her book today, Trauma and Truth, Teaching Russian Literature on the Chechen Wars. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Department of German and Russian at Wake Forest University, as well as the book's publisher, Academic Studies Press. My name is Matthew Charlton, and I am the Sales and Marketing Director at ASP, and have the great pleasure of introducing Elena today. A bit of housekeeping first. We will be recording this event and posting it on our social media accounts and on our websites within 24 hours after the event ends. And an email of that recording will go out to everybody who registered. We will also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A box and we will try to get to them all at the end of the presentation. ASP is offering a discount for the book, so you can get 40% off Trauma and Truth by visiting our website, www.academicstudiespress.com, and using the code TraumaTruth at checkout. And I will also be sure to drop that information into the chat box. We also encourage you to request that your library purchase the volume, whether it be in hardback or digital format. And also, if you do get a hold of the book, we always request that you take the time to review it. If it's on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever it makes sense, it does really help make the book more discoverable to future readers. And now for our intro. Elena Pedigo Clark received a BA in International Studies from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, an MA in Russian translation from Columbia University, and a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is currently an assistant professor of Russian at Wake Forest University. Her research interests include Russian identity formation, the connection between form and meaning in both poetry and prose, and the theme of war, addiction, and contemporary literature. She is also active in disability advocacy in the Wake Forest community. And with that, we will now turn it over to Elena.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm very happy to be here. Welcome to my book talk. And a huge thanks again to Academic Studies Press for hosting this and also for their support of this project over the several years that it has taken to bring it to this point. Also a huge thanks to my department, the Wake Forest Department of German and Russian, and to Wake Forest University for their support of the project throughout its life. I'm going to start with a little talk about the book and sort of background on the book and the books that I cover in my book, a little bit of talk about why I decided to start teaching Russian war literature, why I think it can be a useful thing to do, some tips from my experience teaching Russian war literature, and then I'm going to do a reading from the conclusion of the book. And then there should be a fair amount of time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So with that, let's jump into the talk. Let's see if I can advance to my next slide. So first of all, I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I chose this topic, because a lot of people might be like, why Chechen war literature? Why would you do that? Oops, sorry. Why would you do that? Why not do something like fun and sexy and something like that? But I had a lot of reasons. I did have some slight personal connections in that I was actually living in Russia when the first Chechen War began. I was very far away from the actual war zone, but it was something that people were talking about. I was very aware that it was happening. I went back to Moscow for a study abroad during the Second Chechen War. Again, I was very far away from the actual war zone, but there were in fact some suicide bombings and attempted suicide bombings in Moscow while I was there. So it was very much in the news. People were very aware of it. Everyone was talking about it. And so I was much more aware of it than I think a lot of Westerners are. And then the other thing that happened was when I was a PhD student at UNC, Arkady Babchenko, who's one of the authors that I profile here, came to UNC and did a reading from his book, One Soldier's War. And I began assigning it to my classes, and it made a huge impression on my students. And then fast forward to when I started at Wake Forest here, and our ROTC students were asking about stuff about the Chechen Wars because they were doing projects for their military science classes. And they started asking about Chechen War literature and scholarly resources on Chechen War literature. And I looked into it and I discovered there was nothing, or almost nothing. And so I thought, I should write an article about this. I've been teaching One Soldier's War for several semesters now. I should do an article on this. And one of my students, Logan Stinson, was also very interested in it. He was one of our honors students, and we decided to co-write an article together, which we did, and which was then published. But somehow in all of this, I found myself writing 100,000-word book manuscript. Like, it just kind of happened as I was doing this, you know how it happens. And that was not the book that I was planning to write. I was originally planning to take my dissertation, which was about the poet Boratinsky, and expand that into a book about Finland in Russian literature. And instead, I ended up writing about Chechnya. But that's not completely out of left field. That's not completely different, because Finland is also sort of the periphery of the 19th century Russian Empire. It also had Russian authors, you know, significant Russian authors who were posted there as part of their military service, and they wrote there about it. And so I just sort of like transferred some of the stuff from Finland southeast to the Caucasus. And I have a little map of the Caucasus here. You can see here's Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. Chechnya is here. It's this region in the North Caucasus. And you can see that, I'm sure everyone knows where and what the Caucasus are, but it's this narrow spit of land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It's mountainous. You have the Russian, Russia, Turkey, that is to say the Ottoman Empire, and Iran or the Persian Empire sort of meeting here. So it's this very contested region. And so anyway, yes, because of sort of student interest, student demand, student desire to do collaborative research, I ended up transferring from sort of my interest from Finland to the Caucasus, to Chechnya, and I ended up producing this book with students helping out in some of the research, and also I ended up teaching some classes on the literature. So that's sort of like how that got started. And then here we are. Now we're at the right time to be at this slide. What books do I cover in my book? I decided to focus on these 4 authors and these 4 works. There were a number of other authors and works that I could have chosen from, but I chose these 4 to focus on because I was particularly interested in the effect of trauma and PTSD on the construction of the texts. And so I wanted to write about was the literature of trauma, which I'll get into in a little more detail in a minute. And so I chose authors who all had direct firsthand experience of the Chechen Wars. And so they all were there either as journalists or combatants, or in many cases, both. But they all had this firsthand experience, eyewitness accounts of it. And so that's sort of the thing that holds them together. At the same time, they are a diverse group of authors. So I have Anna Politkovskaya, who, is a woman and a civilian and a journalist writing nonfiction, writing a sort of investigative journalism about the Second Chechen War. Mikhail Eldon, also a journalist, but also a combatant on the Chechen side, and he wrote this memoir about his experiences. And I believe Mikhail might be on the call, so if we have questions about it, perhaps he can answer them afterwards, and he can maybe speak more eloquently than I can about the book and his experiences. And then Arkady Babchenko, who was a combatant with the Russian Federal Forces, so I have combatants on both sides. And he was a combatant as a conscript during the First War, a contract soldier during the Second War, and then a war correspondent. And then Zakhar Prilyapin, who wrote this semi-autobiographical novel. And I should say that Babchenko's work is mainly a memoir with a little bit of journalism mixed in. But it's all these sort of like short disconnected vignettes. And then Prilyapin is the semi-autobiographical novel that is loosely based on his experiences in Chechnya and Dagestan in the 90s. And he then became a journalist, and Babchenko and Polikovskaya all at various points in their careers worked for Novaya Gazeta. So they sort of knew each other and had that in common as well. But we have this diverse group of authors, a diverse group of books. So we have fiction, nonfiction, journalism, memoir, but they're all this literature of trauma about the Chechen Wars. And the authors, of course, all lived exciting lives. And so I'm not going to go into it a huge amount now, but if you're interested later, maybe I can talk about it a bit. And of course, I'm sure most of us know what happened to Polikovskaya. And then Babchenko and Prilyapin are currently, and have been for some time, heavily involved in the fighting in Ukraine, but on opposite sides, and both loudly proclaiming their Ukrainian heritage as they do this. So that's a very interesting thing. And I shall move on. So I said that I would talk a little bit about trauma theory, and one of the things that I look at in the book, so I sort of discuss my experiences teaching these texts or these authors, suggestions for how you might want to incorporate these texts and these authors into university courses, and then also do an in-depth look at these works by these authors through the lens mainly of trauma theory. And the main text that I used for my understanding of trauma theory was Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery. And she outlines various symptoms of PTSD and how you can see them both, in people and in texts. And so I use her description of symptoms of PTSD, such as nonlinear memories, which is a big thing. And I sort of show that the nonlinear nature of these texts and how they're fragmentary, nonlinear, non-chronological a lot of the times. And you can see PTSD sort of in the structure of the text itself, I argue. And I was particularly interested in how the PTSD, as I went into this, sort of how the PTSD that results from the asymmetrical battlefield that we have in the global war on terror might be imprinted in the texts. And that's also, I don't really want to get into that too much, but that's a very controversial issue of like, is the asymmetrical battlefield more or less traumatic? Hard to say. Also things that she talks about that I talk about that I then use to analyze the text are this belief in being set apart that many trauma victims have, and how combatants in particular often see themselves as she called it, initiates in the cult of war. And because of this, they're always reaching out to others to try to explain their experiences, while also believing that their experiences cannot be explained or understood. And that's something I think we see very clearly in a lot of these texts. I also refer to Kali Tal's World of Hurt, in which she first defines the literature of trauma. And she says that the literature of trauma is defined by its authors. And so it's, to be the literature of trauma, the author needs to have had a traumatic experience that they are now writing about. So anyone could write a book or a story about the Chechen Wars, but it's only sort of the literature of trauma if they have had a traumatic experience directly related to that, and then they are writing about it. Whereas otherwise, it's not the literature of trauma, it's just someone writing about a war that they don't have firsthand experience of, which of course they can, but it's a different type of literature, according to her. And another thing that she discusses that I incorporate into my own book is this need by people who are writing the literature of trauma Two, she says, bear witness and tell and retell the story of the trauma. And that's something I think we see a lot of in the texts that I go over in the book. And it's also something that I incorporate into the teaching of these texts, because a lot of the students find them very challenging. And one of the things that we sort of talk about sometimes, if they're feeling really challenged by these texts, is how we ourselves are engaging in this act of bearing witness and telling and retelling this truth or this story of this trauma, and that this is an important sort of cathartic or healing or sacred act that we are being part of. And then briefly, because I do mention it in the reading that I'm about to give, I also talk a little bit about Brian Van Riet's concept of a kill memoir. Brian Van Riet is an American veteran of the Iraq War who is also an author. And he had an article in which he describes what he sees as this emerging genre of the kill memoir, which are these books coming out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that are first-person accounts of what he calls the intimate secrets of the taking of a human life. And so American Sniper, for example, is a kill memoir, probably sort of like the ultimate kill memoir, perhaps. And I mention it, I sort of discuss it as how the books that I'm talking about here are in some cases anti-kill memoirs. They're the opposite of a kill memoir. It's not about this is what it's like to go and kill. It's about this is what being in the war did to me, as opposed to what I did to others. So that's a lot of the theory, some of the main theoretical concepts that I use and that I'm going to reference in the reading that I'm going to do in a minute. And then that I'd talk a little bit, and then if there's interest, we can talk about it more during the Q&A. In why teach war texts? Why engage in this, kind of dirty, scary, downbeat, depressing, rather questionable subject? And that is a good question. And it's also the fact that sometimes students, like I said, do find it very challenging and come to me and say, why are we reading this? Why do we have to read this? But I think specifically for Russian literature, it is useful to think about how many of the most significant authors and texts in Russian literature are in fact war texts or war authors. So Lermontov, you could argue, Tolstoy, some say that he sort of invented the genre of war correspondence. And then you get into the 20th century, you have Babel, Sholokhov, Grossman. And so the genre or the topic, however you want to define it, but war writing for Russian literature has been central to it sort of since we've had significant Russian literature, more or less. And so I think it's very helpful, or it can be very interesting to approach Russian literature from this concept of like a war text, and these are war texts. At the same time, war literature provides this deep dive into psychology, both individual psychology and kind of national psychology. And of course, we can think of, War and Peace, for example, which does both. But lots of war writing does this, and it does this in many languages, many cultures, war writing does this, but it's particularly the case in Russian literature, I think. And I've sort of discussed it a little bit with American war writers, that Russian war writing seems to be a little bit different. And we were sort of kicking around like, why is this? Why is this? And the answer that I've come up with provisionally so far is that it's part of the genre of war writing, specifically in Russian literature, is this really deep dive into psychology. And it's used as this vehicle to really consider lots of difficult or painful questions. And so I think that war literature and understanding it as war literature and then reading it at war literature gives you this ability to do this deep dive into individual psychology, but also again into a national psychology, into understanding more sort of a national psyche, if you believe in that kind of thing. And then finally, another thing, and this is a very double-edged sword, is that war as a subject has this magnetic attraction for lots of people, which is both good and bad. And you want to be careful with that. We all want to be careful with our war attraction. And so it can really draw people in, and that's both good and bad. It's sort of like vampires or something, and you can use it kind of like, vampires are a big topic for teaching Russian literature or Eastern European culture. War can be as well. It draws people in. People find it fascinating. People get into really engaged discussions about it. It feels deeply meaningful to lots of people, even if they've never had any kind of actual war experience. It sort of like supercharges the readings and the discussions in a way that other things don't necessarily. And there's lots of other reasons. And like I said, I'm happy to, discuss it further during the Q&A if people want to kick around more ideas for it. At the same time, teaching war texts can be very challenging, especially if you're teaching a Russian war text, especially in this superheated atmosphere that we increasingly find ourselves in now. That's so contentious, and everyone has such deep feelings, and Russia is so demonized at the moment. And so some things that I sort of have discovered through trial and some fairly painful error that I find helpful is it can be very helpful to prepare students ahead of time. I know that trigger warnings are a contentious topic, and oh, sorry, Mikhail was just texting me to ask if he could join. So I'm going to tell him yes. And so trigger warnings are a very contentious topic. I do, when I'm including war texts, or any kind of really challenging text, I do put a content warning on my syllabi. Maybe sometimes students read the syllabus. I don't know. I feel better to have it there. And I tell them, I find it helpful to sort of prepare them ahead of time then in class, sometimes to talk about how this is a very challenging text and it's going to have these things in it. It's okay to feel challenged by it, instead of just sort of throwing it at them with them completely unprepared, to sort of prep them for it a little bit and explicitly acknowledge how challenging they may find this. And another thing, and this probably depends to a certain extent on who your students are. At Wake Forest, a lot of our students don't have a lot of experience with this kind of thing. Like, most of them are traditional students. They're 18-year-olds. They don't have any military service behind them. They haven't had any firsthand experience of war or a lot of the things that we're reading about. And so they can find it pretty upsetting to read about. And they also think that it's only in Russia that these things happen. And so I find that I have to tie it in and say, oh, no, of course, we're reading about hazing in the Russian military, which is a huge and very painful topic. But guess what? Hazing happens in all kinds of contexts. And you too have probably experienced hazing, especially those of you who are, for example, rushing for a fraternity. And to sort of try and bring that together so that they understand that it's not just about, this is how horrible Russia is, but these are these universal experiences that anyone can have, that humans have in all, sort of all human cultures. And we're reading about this expression of it, and sort of draw connections between what they've experienced and what they're reading about in the text. At the same time, negative emotions can come up, and I do think it's helpful to sort of allow students to express their feelings, if necessary, including negative feelings. My own experience as an undergrad was frequently that we'd be given some text that I didn't really understand. I was really sort of put off and taken aback by it, upset by it. And then I was just told, like, no, this is a brilliant work and you have to love it. And I found that it just turned me off from the text more. And it can be sort of helpful, I think, to acknowledge that, yes, like this text can trigger negative emotions, and that's okay. And it's okay to feel these negative emotions. That doesn't mean that it's a bad text. It just means that it's bringing up stuff that we need to think about. And finally, again, and I think this is super important in the current atmosphere, is it's helpful to keep the humanity of the authors and the protagonists front and center as you're doing this, and so it doesn't just turn into whole like, oh, these faraway people that are nothing like me are just so horrible, like nothing like this could ever happen to me. But to draw those connections and to focus on the very human experiences behind what we're reading and how we have these shared connections and these shared humanity. And that is sort of some of the main tips that I have. And again, I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. But first, if we are ready, maybe I'll go and do my reading from the conclusion, and I'll just go back to the first screen. So I wanted to read from the conclusion of the book. And again, also a huge thanks. I've gotten lots of compliments on the cover and layout of the book. I think it looks lovely too. So big thanks to the publisher for that. And I'm going to read about 15 minutes or so from the conclusion, and then I'm happy to engage in some discussion. So, for all four of the writers surveyed here, the wars in Chechnya were hell. Their perception and treatment of it was very different, however. For Politkovskaya, the Chechen Wars were the epitome, culmination, apogee, and defining symptom of the sickness of the Soviet and post-Soviet system, which treated its citizens as disposable objects, to be exploited for gain and then tossed away. For Eldon, war was hell, but it was also a cleansing hell fire, which stripped away his civilized pretenses and allowed him to come into contact with the divine. For Prilyapin, war was hell, but it was also an opportunity to experience death, life, and rebirth. For Babchenko, war was perhaps the most hellish of all, as his autobiographical protagonist is dragged down into it and can never fully escape, becoming instead one of its gatekeepers. This ambiguous relationship with war, particularly these especially unpleasant wars, and the extreme trauma they inflicted on everyone who experienced them, is reflected not just in the subject matter of the literature about them, but in its form. None of the authors featured here, all of whom were chosen as being important and representative of the writing about the Chechen Wars, have produced coherent, straightforward narratives. Instead, their writing is marked by its fragmentariness, as they struggle to pull together their impressions into something that the reader can understand, when the main thing they want the reader to understand is just how impossible it is to understand the hellish madness that is the prime hallmark of war, especially these wars. Each author has depicted the fragmentation caused by the trauma of war in a different way. Politkovskaya's works are collections of articles and essays, all featuring different people and differing viewpoints. The Russia she depicts is a nation that is splintering apart into apathy, corruption, and violent nationalism. Rather than tell a single coherent story, she tells the story of this splintering through brief slice-of-life vignettes from the different actors involved. This polyphony, I argue, represents the trauma of the nation as a whole, as she attempts to tell the story of post-Soviet Russia and the Chechen Wars by presenting opposing sides and unwelcome truths, even as she binds the whole thing together with her own commitment to the truth as she sees it, and her rock-hard conviction in the righteousness of her cause. She also counters the rights-based masculine ethics of the current Russian regime and of modern democratic and semi-democratic nations with a feminine ethics of care, while basing much of her own moral authority on her status as a woman and a mother. Gender, and specifically femininity, is thus central to her writing and her overall stance, even though she is writing on the most masculine of all topics, war. Part of the hellishness of the wars and of current Russian society in her formulation is that it criminalizes the maternal instinct and fails to provide for its sons as a good motherland should. Eldon's experiences of the wars are marked by the brain damage and severe psychological trauma he sustained while being tortured by Russian forces. This is represented in the text through nonlinear stream of consciousness passages, which often jump from the first person singular to the second person or the first person plural. This literal disassociation from himself is, he explicitly acknowledges, his way of dealing with these traumatic memories, allowing him to tell his story without reliving it directly. At the same time, he shows his own personal experience as being representative of Chechnya's national experience, paralleling his own suffering and eventual personal victory with that of the moral victory he sees Chechnya as having won. Although his work is much less focused on gender than Polikovskaya's, he does depict Chechnya as both feminine, a sacrifice to a dragon, and masculine, Christ and St. George, and emphasizes positive masculine, the honorable warrior, and feminine, the brave and pure woman supporting her warrior, as roles as examples of Chechen spirit. Of the works featured here, his memoir is perhaps the most consciously aware of the effects of his personal trauma on his memory and psyche, while also being more than just one person's experience of PTSD. Instead, he turns his initial individual trauma and eventual triumph into a story of national trauma and triumph. Like Politkovskaya, his narrative is the narrative of an entire nation, one that was offered up by the world as a sacrifice to the dragon of Russia's longtime colonial ambitions and current post-Soviet anxieties. Babchenko's book is also both personal and collective, although in his case, the collective is that of combat veterans, not the nation as a whole. He tells the story of one soldier's war, which he turns into every soldier's war, through short narratives that jump back and forth in time and leave out as much as they include. Rather than writing yet another kill memoir, Babchenko has given us a kind of anti-kill memoir, where combat and killing are given little weight, while the protagonist's psychic experiences are given center stage, and the person who is killed in the story is, metaphorically at least, himself. At the same time, even as he shows himself and his fellow veterans as trapped in hell and cut off from the world of the living by their trauma, he also shows them as being connected to each other and to countless generations of other soldiers and trauma victims through the mythic cycles they are all enacting. Although Babchenko shows no conscious intent to play with or subvert gender roles, the mythic cycles he depicts are often feminine in nature, with a strong presence of the myth of Persephone in section 2 of the book. It is only women, however, who can actually live out the entirety of the Persephone and Demeter story in Babchenko's formulation. Men are unable to pull themselves out of the underworld and back into the land of the living. One Soldier's War, with its desperate desire to share the story of the wars and its closing insistence on the impossibility of telling their whole truth, may be the clearest example of the oscillation between clinging and isolation and the sense of special apartness that Herman describes as typical of trauma victims, particularly combatants. Finally, Prilepin's semi-autobiographical fictional protagonist Yegor Tashevsky also undergoes a descent into the hell of war. In his case, however, this does not tear him apart into fragments as it does for Eldon and Babchenko, but pushes him into rebirth and the potential for wholeness. Tashevsky displays many of the characteristics of trauma and of the different popular conceptions of veterans of the current global war on terror, whether Russian or Western, but he refuses to accept others' labels of him. And while war was hellish for him, the trauma it inflicts on him is also a reflection of his primal trauma of the dissolution of his family and rejection by the females, canine and human, whom he loves. Deeply sexual, and yet cut off from others, and especially females and the generative forces of femininity, Yegor struggles with gender and sex throughout the book. His near death and rebirth in the deadly, life-giving, feminine waters of the river and the ravine at the beginning and end of the book, though, followed by his rescue of the stray female dog in the final scene, signals some kind of acceptance of and by femaleness, suggesting the possibility of reconciliation and healing. by descending into the hell of war and the underworld of his own memories, Taushevsky is eventually able to reconstruct himself as a whole individual, thus making pathologies perhaps the most disturbing and yet hopeful of the works featured here. For all of these authors, war was not just a gateway to hell, but the portal to truth, even if their truths were all different. Politkovskaya and Eldin both wanted to tell an objective truth. Eldin the truth of the Chechen side of the war, and Politkovskaya the truth of all sides. Eldin also describes coming into contact through his suffering with a higher truth, a spiritual truth that anyone, presumably, can access under the right circumstances. Prilyapin and Babchenko's goals were different, with both of them in their own ways setting out to tell the truth of their experiences in the war. Theirs is an internal truth, rather than the external truth of Politkovskaya and Eldin, although their internal truths are by necessity different. For Babchenko's autobiographical protagonist, the truth is what he personally experienced on both an extremely physical level, the mud, the hunger, the cold, and on an emotional level, as his protagonist struggles to keep his equilibrium amidst alternating states of terror and exhilaration. For Prilyapin's fictional Yegor, the truth is something that must be pulled together from different threads of untruths and old memories, and the war is the catalyst that allows him to do that. For all of these writers, whatever their truths might have been, the truth was something they had an intense compulsion to share with others, bearing their souls in a very public manner and risking social ostracism and political backlash, and even, in the case of Politkovskaya, paying for it with her life. This intense need to share the truth, as both a form of bearing witness and a way of achieving catharsis, unites all these works as being the literature of trauma. Not all of the truths these authors have chosen to share are palatable, but the fact that they were willing to risk so much to share them argues that we should pay close attention. And what do these works herald for the future? Can we use them, like Prilyapin's Yegor, as crystal balls, trying to divine what will be for Russia and the rest of the world within its sphere of influence? Divination is a risky business, but perhaps we can give it a shot, or at least draw a few useful conclusions. First of all, Russia itself seems deeply fragmented and divided. This is not surprising in a huge, multi-ethnic country that has been through so many traumatic events in the past 3 decades. But it does the rest of us well to remember that Russia is not a monolithic entity, and neither are the Russians. All the authors featured here are, on one level, Russian, in that they were all citizens of the Russian Federation and spoke Russian, and on another, not wholly Russian. Eldin is Chechen, and Politkovskaya, Prilyapin, and Babchenko all have at least some Ukrainian roots, something that became increasingly important as the situation in the Donbass dragged on, and Prilyapin and Babchenko very publicly took opposite positions on it, both of them alluding to their Ukrainian heritage as they did so. The multi-ethnicity of so many of Russia's citizens, and the shared heritage of so many Russians and Ukrainians, could serve as a cause for hope for some kind of a mutually agreeable settlement in eastern Ukraine, and for greater ethnic tolerance in Russia in general, but so far the opposite is the case. Indeed, the conflict in the Donbass has, at the time of writing, descended into full-scale war following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. As part of this tragedy, nationalism has been separating Russians from Ukrainians and Ukrainians from Russians, serving as a rallying cry for conflict rather than as a call for cooperation. As I suggest in the chapter on Prilyapin, there may be some slight cause for hope in a change in the attitudes of the uber-nationalistic, at least on the Russian side, but as of yet, that hope is very faint. Second of all, one can conceptualize the collective subconscious of Russia as deeply traumatized. As Herman notes, all of Eastern Europe is experiencing a kind of communal, national PTSD since, quote, in the aftermath of systematic political violence, entire communities can display symptoms of PTSD, trapped in alternating cycles of numbing and intrusion, silence and reenactment. Like traumatized individuals, traumatized countries need to remember, grieve, and atone for their wrongs in order to avoid reliving them. This may be the most important thing for outside observers to understand. that Russia as a country is much like the individual Russian veterans who appear so tough on the outside, but who are constantly on the edge of an internal implosion, refighting the war over and over again inside their own heads, always on edge, always on the lookout for danger. This should not be taken as simple weakness, however. Such people are, in fact, in many cases, quite ready to make more war under the right circumstances. And how often the right circumstances seem to crop up, since war is what they know. War is where they feel at home. War is where they feel safest and freest. Russia is full of such people, and they vote, engage in political demonstrations, and hold political office. This is not to point the finger at veterans in particular. Those who were never within 1,000 kilometers of any of the many front lines that have run through the former USSR within living memory are still affected by the collective trauma of World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the civil war in Tajikistan, the Chechen Wars, and the current conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine. These books on the Chechen Wars are as much emblematic of this overall trauma as they are about the specific trauma of these small, if dirty and hellish, wars. And the wars and their aftermath can be seen as a microcosm of the entire post-Soviet experience. One could argue that all of Russia is suffering from a shared PTSD and reacts accordingly to threats and encroachments on her personal space, as we are currently seeing played out in Ukraine. At the same time, all the authors provide faint glimmers of hope. All of them suggest the possibility of empathy for others and a kinder, more connected society, even as they reject it as a current reality. Politkovskaya describes numerous examples of person-to-person connections that provide help for those in need, and argues forcefully for a shared sense of values and an emphasis on the personal and human over the impersonal and inhumane. Eldon depicts both a connection with the divine and a shared code of the warrior that enables fighters on opposing sides to understand and even empathize with each other. Babchenko struggles to connect with civilians and even other soldiers, but ultimately shows himself and everyone else touched by the war as part of the same mythic cycles, finally achieving a moment of transcendent union as he stands on the same runway where so many other soldiers have stood before. Prilepin's semi-autobiographical protagonist Yegor consistently denies his connection to others, while also discovering himself through combat and, in the end, connecting with others through shared suffering and travail, as expressed in Romans 8:22. All of these works are as fragmented in form as the individual and national psyches they represent. But they all also depict a yearning for wholeness and potential paths towards achieving it. While each path is different, they all suggest that, ultimately, breaking through the isolation and oscillating dance of outreach and withdrawal that marks trauma and its aftermath is possible, if only those on both sides of the divide can summon up the courage to do so. So, if we wish to engage in this thought exercise and see these individual works as representative of the post-Soviet experience as a whole, what does that mean? How can those on the outside best relate to individuals and nations in this situation? Especially when that nation is Russia. Nationwide interventions and forced therapy, even if they were not unacceptable attacks on another person's and another nation's sovereignty, which some would certainly consider them to be, are not possible in the case of Russia, a nuclear superpower. Even in the case of smaller, less militarily aggressive nations, such actions do not have a great history of success. Understanding may be the only option left. It is my sincere hope and my sincere belief that literature, which is the closest one can come to sharing thoughts directly with another person and achieving immediate mind-to-mind empathy, is one of our best tools for achieving this. We cannot prevent what has already happened in Chechnya, but perhaps there are those who, if they can summon up the wisdom and the compassion, can prevent similar tragedies in the future. The knowledge is there if we would be willing to heed it. Thank you very much. And I'm now happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you very much, Elena, for the reading and for the presentation. If anybody has any questions, you can either drop them into the chat box or the Q&A box, or if you wanted to ask something on screen, that's fine too. You can just raise your hand and we can show your screen. We have a long question here from Kit Pribble. And hi, Elena. Thank you so much for this great talk and for the introduction to your book regarding the potential impact of the non-symmetrical battlefield on both the shape of personal trauma and the form of war literature. Do the texts that you look at and/or Chechen war literature in general overlap with or differ from war writing produced during or about other world military conflicts in ways you found particularly interesting? You talked a bit about the deep dive into psychology in Russian as opposed to American war literature, and I'd love to hear more about that, or if there was anything else. And then we also have a second question from Kit. If there's time, how would you recommend incorporating one or more of these texts into a literature class that also includes classical Russian text on military conflict in the Caucasus, such as Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time or Tolstoy's Hedi Marat? How do you see your text in dialogue with those 19th century novellas?
Thanks very much, Kit. Those are a couple of great questions, and I will try to answer them as best I can. So as far as the asymmetrical battlefield, what we're talking about is this, when you have, like the situation in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, where you've got sort of insurgents hiding out, and you're not facing them directly in an ordinary battle, but you're constantly on the lookout for IEDs or whatever. And it's questionable whether that causes more or less PTSD. And there's a lot of question about, like, is modern PTSD, like, is the modern battlefield worse than older battlefields? And in general, a lot of people do seem to believe that the modern battlefield, whether it's an asymmetrical battlefield or a more sort of traditional, sort of like World War I, World War II style battlefield, is much more traumatizing than pre-20th century battlefields, because the battlefield is so much larger and the weapons are so much more destructive. And the asymmetrical battlefield is very frightening, because you're dealing with people, you don't know if the people you're dealing with are combatants or your friends. And so soldiers that I've talked to who've been in the asymmetrical battlefield say that it's terrifying, because you don't know, like, anyone you meet could be a potential enemy and you don't know. And so it causes a lot of PTSD. At the same time, we're also hearing a lot of reports coming out of Ukraine now with this more sort of like World War I, World War II style battlefield that we're seeing there, that is actually turning out to be incredibly traumatic, including for people with experience with the asymmetrical battlefield, that Western volunteers who have experience in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, places like that, are actually finding the battlefield in Ukraine to be even more traumatic. So that's kind of a side note. But I was very interested in the disconnected narrative, the disconnected style of the narratives in these works that I cover, and in sort of work about the Chechen Wars in general, and how it seemed to be really, I didn't find a lot of works that were just sort of like a linear narrative that made a lot of sense in a way, that just sort of followed events chronologically, and it was easy to follow what was happening. And at first, I sort of thought that was the result of the asymmetrical battlefield. It also just seems to be an aspect of PTSD, but I see that as very different than works, for example, like War and Peace, like Grossman's Stalingrad and things like that, where you have a much more linear narrative that sort of makes a lot more sense, and it's much easier to follow along with what's happening. And I don't know how much of that, and this is still very much up in the air, if we're, theories about war writing in general, I don't know how much of that is the result of the asymmetrical battlefield, and how much is just that these wars are so recent. And so what we're getting here is just like the PTSD flashbacks kind of thing, and that you need more time for authors to be able to process them into much more linear narratives. It's interesting that the most linear narrative that I found about the Chechen Wars is Vladimir Makanin's a son, and of course he had no direct experience of the combat and produced this much more linear sort of traditional Russian literature style of story. Let's see. There were many more parts to that question. As far as incorporating these texts into a course that teaches general, Russian literature in general, something like with Lermontov or Tolstoy or something, I think that's a great question. And for these texts in particular, what I might do, because they are fragmented and nonlinear, is I might take sections either from Eldon's The Sky Wept Fire or Babchenko's One Soldier's War, and read them in conjunction with Haji Murat's and or Prisoner of the Caucasus or something like that. Because the authors are at least somewhat, and in Eldon's case, very explicitly aware of the Russian literature background that they're coming from. And you can see a lot of echoes, I think, of Tolstoy and Lermontov and Pushkin in these contemporary works. And of course, these are kind of the same wars, right? So there were like in the 19th century, there were wars in the Caucasus that people like Lermontov and Tolstoy were seeing. And then in the 20th and 21st century, we have more Russian authors involved in wars in the Caucasus. And there's a specific section in One Soldier's War that I think is seems to be an echo of Lermontov's Son, The Dream. And so I think that those two could be read very fruitfully together. Again, I think you could read Eldon's biography, memoir, or sections of his memoir with Haji Murat and sort of see how you see these parallels between what people were writing about in the 19th century, what people were writing on the 20th and 21st century. As far as the deep dive into the psychology and the difference with Western and Russian literature, I tried to read a fair sampling of the English language writing that's coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's certainly some diving into the psychology there. There are a lot of kill memoirs, some of which are of not great literary interest. American Sniper, I think, is not that great a read, to be honest. If you're going to read a kill memoir, read Sniper 1. It's much better. But I think that even the stuff that's more overtly literary, of the Western sort of GWAT literature that's coming out, I think a lot of American writing that is coming out about it is much more interested in literary style and is kind of afraid of intense emotions. And we have this sort of blessing and curse in that American veterans, and I know we're about to run out of time, but American veterans have all this access to creative writing programs, which is fabulous, and I'm totally for that. But we get a whole lot of writing that sounds very much like something that's come out of a creative writing program, whereas these Russian language authors are just kind of writing, and they're writing in the tradition of Russian literature, but they're not seeing themselves as sort of writing literary fiction. They have not been trained in the in an American MFA program, and so I think that they have more of their own unique voice, and they're also much less afraid of expressing intense emotion and like really diving down into the darkness of their psyche and the intense emotions that they experienced in this kind of like almost naive way, but very intensely affecting. So there's that, and maybe we can talk about it more at like some other time if you want to.
Thank you. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to drop them in, or you can raise your hand if you wanted to ask something on screen. I know we do have one of the authors here in attendance, so I don't know if they wanted a chance to jump in, but if they did.
Yeah, if Mikhail is here. Mikhail, вы здесь? I see him. Mikhail, Вы нас слышите? Вы здесь?
Да, я вас слышу.
So Mikhail is here if anyone has any questions for him. And or maybe if we want to ask him, you know, what prompted him to, you know, if he wants to tell us a little bit about why he wrote his memoir. Михаил, вы не хотите рассказать нам немножко о том, почему вы писали эту книгу?
Ну, я, во-первых, рассматриваю это как свой долг журналиста. Во-вторых, мне очень хотелось поделиться этим нечеловеческим опытом с людьми, чтобы никогда больше такого не повторилось нигде.
Ну, хорошо, спасибо. So he said that as a journalist and as a person who experienced this, he wanted to share this human experience with others so that it never happened again.
Ну и в-третьих, это было завещание моих погибших товарищей. Они очень хотели, чтобы я рассказал правду.
And his comrades who died in the wars also, he wanted in their honor to tell the truth about it. Да, ну спасибо вам большое. И спасибо вам еще раз за вашу помощь. So Mikhail has been extremely helpful throughout the writing process of this book and has answered lots and lots of questions and has worked with my students one-on-one when we've read his book in my class. He's been extremely helpful.
Вам спасибо, Лена, вам. Вы эту работу сделали.
Ну, спасибо. Any more questions?
I don't think we have any more questions here, but I mean, I would like to just ask, what is the next research project and how does that develop from some of the ideas that you've been formulating while working on this book?
Yeah, so the next research project, there's two aspects to it, and I'm not entirely sure which way I was going to go yet. I became very interested in sort of women's war writing, and I specifically wanted to do something with Polikovskaya and or Alexievich and devote something specifically to them and their writing and sort of women's writing about war. But I was also very interested in this question of war addiction that comes up a lot in these texts. And I was particularly interested because, as I mentioned, both Babchenko and Prilepin have then gone on to be involved in other wars. They're both currently actively involved in the war in Ukraine. Babchenko currently, like he had this whole experience of apparently being captured and tortured and subjected to a mock execution by Ukrainian forces, even though he was on their side, that made him stop going into the front. But he's like actively raising money for the Azov battalion apparently right now. And Prilepin apparently just after creating his own battalion for the Professor Kharchenko for the Lugansk People's Republic, he now just enlisted in the Russian National Guard and is apparently serving in Ukraine at the moment, supposedly. And they both they keep coming back to it. They can't leave it. Like they hate it so much, but they can't quit it. And so I'm very interested in this question of war addiction and why are people so addicted to war and how does this appear in literature and why are anti-war texts and anti-war creative works so often, why do they act as recruitment tools? So like, why is Full Metal Jacket such a great recruitment tool? Why is Apocalypse Now such a great recruitment tool? Babchenko tried to write this anti-war book about how horrible it was to serve in the Chechen Wars, and now he's getting letters from people's, teenage boys saying, "Thank you, Arkady Arkadyevich, I've enlisted because of you." And so I'm interested in that. How I'll bring the two together, I'm not quite certain yet, but that's kind of like what I'm looking at the moment.
Excellent, something to look forward to. Well, I guess, yeah, we've hit the hour mark here. Yeah, thank you very much, Elena, for the presentation. And for the reading and for answering our questions and to our guest attendees as well. And again, this will be sent out to everybody who registered, and it'll be available on our website. And again, discount code for the book, if you did want to order it, is in the chat box, but it'll also be sent out with that email as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.